The fall wind from Lake Michigan played fallen leaves on the immaculately mowed lawns of Gold Coast. Merritt Caldwell stood at the panoramic window of her gallery, gazing out at passers-by. Her precise profile reflected in the glass, creating a whimsical play of shadows against the backdrop of paintings by contemporary artists. The Caldwells had moved to this upscale Chicago neighborhood 3 years ago when Grayson had gotten a promotion at an investment bank. Merritt, by then, had already opened her own contemporary art gallery, which quickly became popular among the local elite. They were called the perfect couple, she with her refined taste and art world connections, he with his financial genius and charisma. Their penthouse on the 47th floor of a skyscraper overlooking the lake was the epitome of success. Minimalist interior, author's furniture, a collection of rare wines in a special room with climate control. Everything said that people who knew how to appreciate beauty lived here. Every morning, Grayson spent an hour in the home gym, then his driver took him to the business center of the city. Merritt preferred walking to the gallery, enjoying the architecture of the historic mansions. Today was a special day, the opening of a new exhibition. Merritt scrutinized the arrangement of paintings, corrected the sign near the center canvas. At 7 o'clock, the first guests would arrive, and everything had to be perfect. Grayson had promised to arrive early. He always supported his wife's endeavors, though he wasn't particularly interested in modern art. The main thing was to see Merritt's happy smile when she told him about the next talented artist she discovered. Their marriage was considered by many to be exemplary. 8 years together, shared interests, respect for each other's space. They attended charity events, hosted dinner parties. Their photos appeared in the Society Chronicle. The only thing they lacked for full compliance with the standards of high society, children. But the subject was never raised in their home. In the evening, the gallery was filled with guests. Merritt fluttered between groups of visitors, talking about the concept of the exhibition. Grayson stood at the bar, sipping whiskey and watching his wife. At that moment, a couple approached him, a tall man in an expensive suit and a spectacular brunette. "Excuse me, you're the husband of the gallery owner, aren't you? I'm Flint Everett, and this is my wife Dakota. We recently moved to Chicago and are still settling into the local community." Grayson smiled and extended his hand in greeting. The Victorian-style mansion on a quiet street in the Chicago suburbs didn't attract the attention of casual passers-by. Only the initiated knew that behind the heavy oak doors lurked one of the city's most private clubs. Aphrodite's was open 3 times a week, and the only way to get in was by personal invitation. Merritt and Grayson Caldwell first stepped through the door 6 months ago. Boredom, the usual companion of affluent couples whose lives were too prosperous to be interesting, had brought them here. Every Thursday they left their real names at the door, introducing themselves to other guests as Diana and Mark. The interior of the club was strikingly luxurious in old Europe. Velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and paintings in heavy gilded frames created an atmosphere of refined decadence. Live jazz was playing in the main room, and waiters in white gloves were serving champagne and delicacies. That evening, the Caldwells noticed new guests. Flint and Dakota Everett, whom they'd met at a trade show the week before, were sitting by the fireplace. Dakota was wearing a long black dress with an open back, her dark hair flowing over her shoulders. Flint, impeccably dressed as always, was saying something, and she was laughing, tilting her head back. "What a coincidence," Grayson said, heading for the fireplace. Merritt followed, noting how gracefully Dakota held her wine glass. It turned out that the Everetts had been members of the club for 2 years, but had spent the last few months in Europe. Dakota talked about the clinics in Switzerland, where she was learning new techniques in gynecology. Flint mentioned a complicated case he was handling at the International Court of Justice. The evening flowed into the night. A quartet played slow songs, couples twirled in a dance. Grayson invited Dakota, Flint invited Merritt. The music enveloped them, erasing the boundaries of personal space. At 3 in the morning, the 4 of them stepped out onto the terrace. The fall air was fresh and clean. Dakota took out a thin cigarette. Flint flicked a vintage lighter. They talked about traveling, art, music. The topics changed, but no one mentioned work or money, an unspoken rule of the club. By the end of the week, they met again. This time, the Everetts invited the Caldwells to their Lincoln Park mansion for dinner. Dakota proved to be an excellent hostess. She cooked her own food and made the wine list. After dinner, they adjourned to Flint's study, where a discussion about contemporary art ensued to the sound of vinyl. The following Thursday at the Aphrodite, they shared a table. Merritt noticed how the atmosphere of their conversation had changed. Casual touches, long glances, soft laughter. Everything spoke of the growing attraction between the couple. At midnight, Flint suggested going up to one of the private parlors on the second floor. The room was decorated in Oriental style, low sofas, silk-embroidered cushions, heavy curtains the color of burgundy wine. Cognac glimmered in a crystal decanter. They talked about freedom, about the conventions of morality, about everyone's right to control their own lives. Dakota sat in the armchair with her foot on her leg, her dress slipping seductively up her thigh. Merritt caught Grayson's gaze fixed on Flint's wife. Strangely, it didn't make her jealous. That night was the first time they broke the boundaries of convention. In the morning, each returned to his home, to his normal life, but something had changed irrevocably. They began to meet every week, either at the club, the Everett Mansion, or the Caldwell penthouse. Their union was perfect. Two couples, equal in social status and intelligence, free from prejudice, able to keep secrets. Chicago knew them as two respectable married couples whose paths occasionally crossed at fundraisers and social gatherings. In early December, the Everetts invited the Caldwells to their country home in Lake Forest. The mansion, built in the 30s, was buried in snow. Tall, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked frozen Lake Michigan. Dakota greeted her guests in a long cashmere sweater and tight pants. Her dark hair was gathered in a careless knot, revealing a graceful neck. Flint was stoking the fireplace in the living room. Grayson had brought a collector's wine. Merritt had brought gourmet cheeses from a small French shop in Gold Coast. The evening began with a tasting. Flint talked about the wines, his low voice mesmerizing. Dakota cooked duck confit, and the aroma of herbs filled the house. Merritt helped her in the kitchen, their hands sometimes touching, causing a slight shiver. Grayson and Flint discussed art by the fireplace, amber whiskey gleaming in their glasses. After dinner, they moved to the conservatory. Stars were visible through the glass roof. Music poured from an old record player, 50s jazz, Ella Fitzgerald's husky voice. Dakota danced with Grayson, her hands resting on his shoulders. Merritt watched them, leaning back against Flint's chest. The passion between them grew slowly, like expensive wine. They met every weekend either in town or out of town, rode on Flint's yacht, attended private shows at the Merritt Gallery, dined at the best restaurants in Chicago. In January, the four of them flew to the Caribbean for a week. A secluded villa on the ocean became their refuge from winter and conventions. The days passed in serenity and tranquility. They swam in the warm waters, sunbathed on the white sand, drank cocktails at sunset. At night, their passion became more and more frank. Rustling sheets, quiet moans, lips touching heated skin. They switched partners, exploring each other, discovering new facets of pleasure. Dakota was tender and passionate at the same time. Merritt was sensual and liberated. Flint captivated with his masculinity, Grayson with his refined sensuality. Back in Chicago, they continued to meet. Their relationship became deeper, more intimate. They shared their innermost thoughts, secret desires. Between them, there was no jealousy or rivalry, only mutual attraction and respect. In society, they maintained impeccable manners. At a charity ball at the opera, Dakota shone in a Chanel gown, Merritt charmed in vintage Dior. Their husbands were paragons of elegance in tuxedos. None of the guests could guess the nature of their relationship. In the spring, they spent a weekend in New York. They stayed in adjoining suites in the plaza, attended private exhibitions, dined at Michelin-starred restaurants. On the last night, they climbed to the roof of the hotel. Manhattan sparkled with lights below. Champagne sparkled in the glasses. Dakota stood at the parapet, the wind playing with her silk dress. Grayson hugged her from behind, kissing her shoulders. Flint and Merritt watched them, holding hands. In that moment, they felt free of all convention, bound only by mutual attraction and tenderness. Their idols seemed unbreakable. They created their own world where they made their own rules. At Golden Medical's private clinic on Michigan Avenue, the workday was coming to an end. Dr. Dakota Everett had just finished her last consultation. Her office on the 20th floor was bathed in the sunset sunlight. The panoramic windows overlooked the lake, with the white yachts in the marina in the distance. There were no more patients in the waiting room. Only the assistant, Sarah, was finishing entering data into the computer. On Dakota's desk was a folder with the results of her own tests, which she had done that morning. Years of medical practice and personal experience left no doubt about the diagnosis. Pregnancy, about 9 weeks along. "Dr. Everett, should I close the lab?" Sarah peeked into the office. "Yes, and you can go home. I'll do some more paperwork." Left alone, Dakota went to the window. Downstairs, people were rushing about, cabs whizzing by, and she stood looking at her reflection in the glass, trying to see any change in it. 15 years of trying to get pregnant, the best clinics in the world, endless procedures, and now it had happened, under these circumstances. It was the usual evening atmosphere in her and Flint's Lincoln Park mansion. The housekeeper had set the table in the conservatory, her husband's favorite spot: antique china, silver, white orchids in a vase of Venetian glass. Dakota had purposely let the servants go early. Flint returned at 7 sharp, as immaculate as ever in a Tom Ford suit, with the faintest whiff of expensive perfume. 15 years of marriage hadn't changed his habit of being elegant in every situation. "You're early today," he kissed his wife. "And let Martha go?" "We need to talk." Dakota poured him a glass of Chateau Margaux, 2010. "Have a seat." Flint lowered himself onto a couch surrounded by the greenery of the conservatory. Evening light filtered through the glass roof, creating whimsical shadows. "I'm pregnant. 9 weeks due." She saw his face change. So many years they'd waited for those words. So many hopes, disappointments, tears. "Are you sure?" His voice trembled slightly. 3 tests and a full blood workup. "I'll do an ultrasound tomorrow." Flint set his glass down slowly. 9 weeks. That means... Yes, New York. We should talk to the Caldwells. He stood up, walked over to his wife, put his arm around her. "How do you want to do that?" "I'll call Merritt tomorrow. We'll invite them over or meet them at their place." The next day they gathered in the Caldwells' penthouse on the 47th floor. Dakota had always admired Merritt's impeccable taste. Antique furniture, collectible paintings, exquisite little details. Every detail spoke of the status and sophistication of the owners. Merritt met them in a Chanel dress, as impeccable as ever. Grayson had just returned from work, but had time to change. Jazz was playing softly in the living room. "I'm pregnant," Dakota said when everyone was seated. "It's 9 weeks along, and we need to do a paternity test." The silence lasted a few seconds. Grayson was the first to break it. "Of course, it's necessary. How soon can we get it done?" "I have connections at Northwestern Medical's genetics lab. Everything will be confidential. Results in a week." Merritt stood up and walked out onto the terrace. A warm spring breeze blew in through the open doors. "What are you planning?" Grayson asked. "I'm keeping the baby," Dakota said calmly. "At my age and with my history, this is my last chance to be a mother." Flint took her hand. "It's what we both want, regardless of the test results." The week of waiting stretched on endlessly. Dakota immersed herself in work. Flint spent more time at home. They didn't see the Caldwells all those days. When the results were ready, the 4 of them met again. This time at the Everett mansion. Dakota pulled out an envelope. "The biological father is Grayson." "I'll cover all expenses," he said immediately. "We'll formalize joint custody if you agree." "I'll raise the baby as my own," Flint added. "It's our joint baby." They talked all evening. They discussed the best clinics, their choice of pediatrician, their plans for the future. Grayson suggested starting a trust fund. Flint talked about a private school he'd already looked at. Dakota shared her plans for the nursery. Only Merritt remained silent, sitting in a chair by the window. Her posture remained impeccable, her makeup betraying no emotion, but her fingers twitched slightly as she brought her water glass to her lips. "I made an appointment with Dr. Steinberg for next Tuesday," Dakota said. "He's the best obstetrician in town. I'd like to attend. Grayson echoed. Me too, Flint added. The evening dragged on late into the night. They talked about the future, made plans, chose clinics. 3 people bound now not only by the past but by a shared future. And only Merritt's figure, frozen at the window, seemed carved out of ice, keeping silence and impeccable manners of a socialite. Merritt flew to Paris for 2 weeks to open a branch of her gallery. She didn't say goodbye to her husband, just left a note on the kitchen table. It had become her habit lately to disappear without explanation. Grayson spent more and more evenings at the Everett mansion. He and Flint spent hours discussing the baby's future, while Dakota worked on paperwork in her home office. Her pregnancy was going easily. She was literally glowing from the inside out. One such evening, with the spring rain rustling outside the windows, they were sitting in the library. Dakota nestled between the men on the wide leather couch, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. Flint was going through her dark hair, Grayson holding her hand. "I'm so happy," she whispered, "with both of you." Her lips met Flint's as Grayson kissed her neck. They melted into each other, forgetting time and convention. Their bodies melded into one, their breaths mingling. Dakota felt loved and protected between 2 men who idolized every inch of her body. In the morning, Dakota woke up in the huge bed between them. The sunlight played on their naked bodies. She could feel their warmth, their breath. Flint hugged her from behind. Grayson pressed against her front. Merritt returned suddenly, a week ahead of schedule. She noticed the change immediately, the new closeness between her husband and the Everetts, their peculiar looks, the occasional touch. "You spend too much time with them," she told Grayson at dinner. "This is my baby, Merritt. We've all waited 15 years for this. It's the child of the whore who ruined our marriage." Grayson slowly lowered the utensils. His face, normally calm, contorted with anger and bewilderment. "Ruined the marriage? What are you talking about? Our marriage is stronger than ever. We're finally going to be parents. Isn't this what we've dreamed of? And don't you dare call Dakota a whore. She's a wonderful woman, a loving wife to Flint. We're all adults who made an informed decision. Our relationship with you, their marriage, it's still the same. It's just that now we're going to have a child, long-awaited, loved, desired by all of us." "All of us?" Merritt hurled the glass at the wall. The wine spread across the white wallpaper like blood. "Yes, by everyone but you," he raised his voice for the first time in 15 years. "And I don't understand why. What's changed, Merritt? Why can't you share our happiness?" The next day, she didn't show up for another doctor's appointment where they found out the sex of the baby. A girl. Flint kissed his wife. Grayson cried with happiness. They were already planning a name for the baby girl. In the evening, Merritt sat in the empty gallery, looking at the city lights below. Whiskey splashed in her glass. For the first time in years, her perfect world was crumbling. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number. "I need your help," she said quietly. "I'll pay you well." Happiness reigned in the Everett mansion. Dakota was blossoming, surrounded by the love of 2 men. They'd turned one of the rooms into a nursery, peach walls, an antique cradle, toys from France. Grayson brought books in 3 languages. Flint ordered a special air purification system. They didn't notice how closely Merritt watched them, how she records their every move, every meeting, how her perfect manicure left marks on the armrests of the chair as she watched their happy faces. A storm was brewing behind their backs, but they were too absorbed in each other to notice the first rumbles of thunder. The next 3 months flew by like one happy day. Dakota was blossoming. Her pregnancy was going easily. Every morning began with breakfast for the 3 of them, Flint cooking gourmet meals, Grayson bringing the freshest pastries from his favorite French bakery. They'd turned one wing of the Everett mansion into a cozy nest for the baby girl to be. Peach tones, a vintage Venetian glass chandelier, an antique cradle from the time of Queen Victoria. Grayson ordered tiny dresses from Milan. Flint found an antique music box in London. The 3 of them traveled to doctor's appointments. Dr. Steinberg, one of Chicago's best obstetricians, quickly became accustomed to this unusual family. Dakota lay on the couch, holding the hands of both men while the ultrasound screen showed the silhouette of their daughter. In the evenings, They often sat in the library. Flint would read aloud children's stories. Practicing, he said. Dakota would settle between them on the couch, resting her head on her husband's lap while Grayson massaged her tired legs. Things were going great at the clinic. Her practice was expanding and she had taken on another assistant. Dakota now specialized only in complicated cases, preparing to gradually reduce her workload before delivery. Every Friday, the three of them had dinner at the best restaurants in town. Afterward, they'd return to the mansion, where their passion was rekindled. They made love until dawn, discovering new facets of intimacy. Pregnancy made Dakota even more sensual, and the men idolized her. Merritt rarely showed up. She was completely immersed in her work, often flying to Europe. Grayson was hardly ever home. He had moved into the guest wing of the Everett mansion, explaining that he was taking care of Dakota. That morning, Dakota woke up in the familiar arms of her two favorite men. They had breakfast on the terrace, admiring the spring garden. She promised to return early. They planned to have dinner at home and discuss a name for their daughter. It was the usual morning silence at Golden Medical Clinic. Dakota arrived early. She liked to do an hour or two of paperwork before the first patients arrived. 5 months pregnant, she'd changed her schedule slightly, but she hadn't changed her habits. Sarah, her assistant, arrived at 8:30 and was surprised to find the office door ajar. Dr. Everett usually kept it closed. A minute later, her scream echoed throughout the floor. Flint was the first to arrive. The police were still cordoning off the crime scene when his Maybach braked sharply at the entrance. He took off up the stairs, ignoring the elevator. "Sir, you can't—" The young officer tried to block his path. "That's my wife!" His scream echoed off the walls. There was a lot of blood in the office. Too much. It soaked the white carpet, splattered the walls, flooded the desk. Dakota lay at the window as if trying to reach for the panic button. Flint collapsed to his knees beside the body. His immaculate suit was soaking up blood, but he didn't notice it. He cradled her head in his lap, stroked her tangled dark hair, whispered her name over and over. Grayson arrived 20 minutes later. He froze in the doorway, unable to believe his eyes. Then he walked slowly over to Flint and sank down beside him on the blood-stained carpet. They sat shoulder to shoulder, two men who had lost everything in an instant, the woman they loved and their unborn daughter. "Sir, we have work to do," Detective Ramirez said softly but insistently. "Please let the forensics team do their job." Flint didn't move. His arms still encircled his wife's body, his lips still whispering her name. Grayson gently touched his shoulder. "Come on, friend, let's go. We have to let them find whoever did this." In the hallway, Flint finally broke down. His sobs shook his entire body. He pounded his fist into the wall until his knuckles began to bleed. Grayson held him, keeping him from falling. They sat in the hallway for hours while the forensics team worked two broken men who yesterday had been immensely happy. Flint was silent, then crying again, but Grayson was silent, tears streaming down his cheeks. "She picked out a name," Flint said suddenly. "For a girl, wanted to tell us tonight." Grayson squeezed his shoulder tighter. Their daughter, their little girl they would never know. By late afternoon, Merritt showed up at the clinic, impeccably dressed, with perfect styling and makeup. She put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "You need to go home, darling. Get some rest." Grayson didn't even look at her. He continued to sit next to Flint, sharing his grief, mourning their shared loss. Flint's office was dark. They had been sitting for hours, and the only source of light was a mahogany desk lamp. On the table, an untouched dinner and a nearly empty bottle of Macallan. "She always knew I'd be home for dinner." Flint twirled the empty glass in his hands. "Even if there was a complicated process, she'd text, just to tell me she loved me. Every day for 15 years. Grayson silently poured more whiskey. "You know, she discussed everything with me. When she fell in love with you, came to me first, said, 'I love you more than life, but there's something different, special there.' We talked all night. She was afraid to hurt me. Can you imagine? Worried about me when she confessed her love for someone else?" His voice shook. "And when she found out she was pregnant, she cried with happiness in my arms for 2 hours. Said it was fate that the baby was yours, that we were finally going to be a real family. She loved us both, Grayson, in different ways, but equally as much." "Merritt was never like that," Grayson said quietly. always kept her distance. Even in intimacy, it was like a glass wall between us. Do you remember how she used to make pancakes on Sundays? Grayson poured more whiskey. In that navy-colored silk robe, humming something, hair gathered in a careless bun. Every Sunday, and she baked for her patients, the ones going through complicated procedures. Flint covered his eyes. You know how many times I woke up in the middle of the night and she was gone? A call from the clinic, emergency labor. She was rushing to save other people's babies, and she's been... For 15 years, she dreamed of her own, and she never complained, never snapped. Only sometimes she cried at night, quietly, thinking I was asleep. And when we found out about the girl, Grayson's voice trembled. She'd already planned it all out. Showed me lists, what books to read, what music to put on. Wanted the baby to listen to Vivaldi from day one. Said she'd have 2 daddies who adored her, and she'd grow up to be the happiest girl in the world. Flint took a big gulp. Last conversation, she said, you know, I finally realized what absolute happiness is. When you love and you're loved and new life grows inside. There was a knock at the door. Detective Thorne Ramirez was tall, trim, with a shrewd look in his dark eyes. His suit looked too expensive for a policeman. Sorry for the late visit, gentlemen, but time is critical in these matters. I need to ask a few questions. Have a seat, Flint gestured to a chair. Whiskey? No, thank you, I'm on duty. Ramirez pulled out a notebook. Tell me about Dr. Everett's last day. Who was the last person to see her? Were there any threats? Any strange phone calls? The 3 of us had breakfast, Grayson began. She was happy, making plans for the evening. The 3 of us? Ramirez raised an eyebrow. Yes, the 3 of us, Flint said firmly. We lived as a family. Dakota carried Grayson's baby. Everything was consensual. And Mrs. Caldwell? Merritt. She didn't approve. Grayson looked away. Didn't approve? Is that a euphemism? Ramirez made a note in his notebook. How exactly did she express disapproval? She's hardly been home the last few months. Been working a lot. Traveled. When was the last time you saw her? 3 days ago. We had a fight. About what? She called Dakota. Grayson fell silent. Never mind, it was just a marital argument. Ramirez looked at him carefully. Everything matters in these cases, Mr. Caldwell. Every detail can be a clue. I know that sounds unusual. Flint rubbed his temples. But if you really want to understand what happened, you need to know everything. Ramirez leaned back in his chair. I have all night. Dakota was special, Flint began. When we met the Caldwells, she immediately felt a connection with both of them. Came to me, told me everything. You know what she said? I don't want secrets between us. You're my anchor, my life. We discussed everything like adults, Grayson added. No mudslinging, no scandals. Just 4 established people who found a special relationship. And then she got pregnant. Ramirez made a note in his notebook. Yes, for 15 years, we both dreamed of having a baby. Both Dakota and I. Grayson lowered his head. When it turned out to be my baby, she glowed, Flint interrupted. You know, she was so happy. Said it was a sign we're a real family now. All those months, she brought us together, made us better. And Mrs. Caldwell? Merritt, Grayson sighed. She's changed, became cold, aloof, sarcastic. Called our relationship a perversion, said we ruined her life. Threatened? The men looked at each other. 3 days ago, Grayson said slowly, she said, I'm not going to let this kid ruin my life. Ramirez stepped forward. The exact words, please. She said, that whore and her bastard won't have my husband. I'd rather... Grayson fell silent. Rather what? Rather kill them both. A heavy silence hung in the study. Where was Mrs. Caldwell this morning? She was supposed to be at the gallery, opening of a new exhibition. Let's check. Ramirez slammed the notebook shut. Gentlemen, I need to know every detail of your relationship, every conflict, every threat. It could be important. Ask her assistant, Sarah, Flint said suddenly. Dakota, she used to tell her everything. They had coffee every morning, discussing patients, plans. Sarah knows more than anyone. I'll be sure to have a chat. Ramirez stood up. And gentlemen, don't leave town. I may need to talk to you again. When the detective left, Flint refilled his glasses again. Do you think... Grayson began. I don't know, Flint cut him short. I just don't know. Grayson awoke to the insistent ringing of the phone. His temples were pounding from the night's whiskey, his mouth dry. The clock read 7 in the morning. It seemed he'd only just closed his eyes after Flint's driver had driven him home. Mr. Caldwell? Ramirez's voice sounded strained. Can you come to the lake? More precisely, you need to come. Gateway number 4. What happened? A lock worker found a car, a black Maybach. Grayson felt a chill go through his insides. Flint, come over. Prepare for the worst. All the way to the lake, he tried to remember the details of last night. How they'd sat in Flint's office, drinking whiskey, talking about Dakota. How the detective had come in. How then Flint had suddenly become strangely silent and thoughtful. It was a chilly morning. Fog drifted over the water. Police flashers painted it red and blue. Several patrol cars, a CSI van, an ambulance. Uniformed and plainclothes men scurried back and forth talking on walkie-talkies. The divers had just lifted the car, water streaming off the black metal, and a dark figure was visible in the cabin. Flint was in the same suit he'd been drinking whiskey an hours ago. No! Grayson rushed forward, but Ramirez held him back. Wait, let the forensics guys finish. Is it definitely him? Yeah. License, cell phone, ring, it's all his. The same sapphire ring you were talking about yesterday. Dakota's 10th wedding anniversary present. Grayson lowered himself onto the parapet. Less than 24 hours. Only less than 24 hours had passed since that dreadful morning when they'd found Dakota. And now Flint, the driver, James, who had worked for the Everetts for the past 7 years, approached them. I should have insisted. His voice shook. Mr. Everett was drunk, but I didn't think he'd never refused my help before. Tell me in order. Ramirez pulled out a notebook. I drove Mr. Caldwell home around midnight, went back for Mr. Everett, but he said he wanted to be alone. I offered to at least wait in the car in the yard. He said no. He said, go home, James. Just go home. Was he desperate? Ramirez asked. No, James shook his head. Pensive, focused, like he was solving a difficult problem. He couldn't do it himself, Grayson said hoarsely. Couldn't have done it. He was talking about Dakota, about how he wanted to keep every single thing of hers as a memento, every picture, every note. Said you can't forget, never to be forgotten. Ramirez sat down next to him. Tell me more about last night, every detail. We drank whiskey, talked about her. Flint told me what she was like. Sunny, kind, how she loved life. Then you arrived. And after you left, he changed. How? Suddenly he stopped talking, started going through the papers in the safe. I asked, what are you looking for? He didn't answer. Then suddenly he said, you know, I think I'm beginning to understand. Understand what? I asked the same thing. He shook his head and poured more whiskey. And then he said a strange phrase. She'd always been perfect. Too perfect. Who? Her. I don't know. I was drunk, didn't pay attention, thought I'd ask in the morning. The CSI walked over to them. Detective, you need to see this. Ramirez stood up. Stay here, Mr. Caldwell. I'll be right back. The sun was rising over the lake. The fog was clearing, revealing a gruesome scene. A mangled Maybach, fussing forensics officers, a black bag on a stretcher. Somewhere in the distance, sirens were blaring. Another police car was rushing to the scene. Grayson looked out at the water. There, in the deep water, his friend had been lying there for hours. The man with whom they'd shared the love of the same woman. The man who had become a brother to him. I'll find it, he said quietly. I swear, Flint, I'll find who did this. Who took Dakota and you from us. I swear on the memory of your unborn daughter. Everything was still the same at Golden Medical Clinic. The white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet voices of the staff. Only Dr. Everett's office was sealed, and a crying Sarah sat in the waiting room. Detective Ramirez settled into the chair across from her. It didn't escape his keen gaze that the girl was nervously rubbing her medical badge. Tell me about Dr. Everett, Ramirez asked softly. She was special. Sarah dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief. You know, usually successful doctors keep their distance with the staff. And she used to make me coffee every morning. Said, you're my mascot. I won't start an appointment without you. Were you too close? Yes, especially the last few months. She was so glowing. This pregnancy, it was a miracle for her. And her personal life? Did she share it with you? Dr. Everett wrote everything down. Sarah nodded at the computer. Kept a diary of sorts every night. The techs cracked the password in an hour. The story of the last few months unfolded before Ramirez. Dakota detailed her happiness, an attentive husband, a caring Grayson, their shared plans for the future. But there was a growing unease in the notes. "Merritt is becoming intolerable," she wrote on March 15th. "She waited for me outside the clinic today. Screamed that I had ruined her life. Flint says ignore it. Grayson is trying to talk to her, but I'm scared. Not for myself, for the baby." "Did Mrs. Caldwell show up here often?" "Yes." Sarah visibly tensed. "Almost every week lately. Making a scene, yelling. And that morning?" "I didn't see her. I came in at 8:30, as usual." Ramirez looked at the surveillance tapes. Merritt showed up at the clinic at 7:30, impeccably dressed, folder in hand. She walked past the front desk with a confident stride. "Detective," one of the officers held out a patient logbook. "Look, Mrs. Caldwell had an appointment with Dr. Chen, scheduled consultation, 8:30 in the morning." At 7:45, Dakota entered the clinic, elegant as always, wearing her favorite blue maternity dress. She walked to her office, reviewing the morning's notes in her clipboard as she went. At 8:30, Sarah discovered the body. The cameras didn't show Merritt again until that moment. Ramirez closed the journal, a story of love and happiness overshadowed by the growing shadow of someone else's hatred. A story that led to 2 deaths. His cell phone rang. "Detective? We found something in Mr. Everett's car. You'd better come over." "Brake hose cut professionally." The mechanic wiped his hands with a rag. "You have to know exactly where to cut. An amateur can't do it." Ramirez examined the cut site. Clean work, no torn edges. Someone knew their craft very well. The forensics expert took photos from different angles, carefully documenting every detail. "Detective," one of the officers waved from the equipment car. "We found the traffic cam footage." A picture of the last minutes of Flint's life unfolded on the screen. A black Maybach was traveling down a deserted road along the locks. The speed of about 60 miles per hour was normal for this stretch. At 2:37, a light-colored sedan came toward him and suddenly began swerving into the oncoming lane. "Reduce playback speed," Ramirez pitched forward. In slow motion, the Maybach could be seen trying to avoid a collision. The asphalt left long traces of the attempted braking, black streaks dotting the road. The car skidded, smashed through the guardrail, and flipping several times, collapsed into the dark water of the sluice. "Sedan fled," the technician scrolled further down the tape. "No license plates visible. Model is hard to determine. Too dark. Looks like a Toyota or Honda." Forensics worked on the road, examining the brake marks. Long black streaks in the asphalt told the story of the last seconds. The desperate attempt to stop the car, the sharp turn of the steering wheel, the inevitable fall. "Check Mrs. Caldwell's phone records." Ramirez pulled out a notepad. "For the last month." An hour later, a printout lay on his desk. Calls to the gallery, vendors, courier services, the usual business activity. But one number caught his attention. Short calls, almost every day, always from a work phone. "Joe Martinez," the technician held out a file. "Runs an auto service center north of the city. Specializes in luxury brands. Mercedes, BMW, Maybach. Run him through the system." "I already did. 2 priors, car theft in '98, insurance fraud in '00. Clean for the last 5 years, the shop's thriving rich clientele." Forensics continued to work at the lock. Divers searched the water for evidence that the current might have carried away. A mountain of folders with photos, reports, technical reports grew on the shore. Ramirez stared out at the dark water. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, but some details still eluded him. Why was Flint on this road at this hour? Where was he going? And most importantly, who was in that light-colored sedan? Joe's auto service greeted the detectives with the smell of machine oil and the rattle of pneumatic wrenches. Rows of elevated premium cars stretched along the walls. Mechanics in blue coveralls scurried between them busily. Joe Martinez himself, A stocky man in his 50s with tattoos on his forearms was wiping his hands with a red rag. His gaze darted for a second to the far corner of the parking lot when Ramirez showed his badge. "What can I do for you?" "Detective Ramirez, we have a few questions about Mrs. Caldwell." A barely perceptible pause, a glance slightly to the side. Fingers gripped the rag tighter. "What about her?" "A lot of calls in the last month. Almost every day." "A client," Martinez shrugged. "Wealthy lady, cranky, oil change, tire rotation. That's what we've got around here." "Is the light-colored Toyota Camry hers too?" Martinez twitched. "I don't know what you mean." Ramirez walked silently out into the parking lot. 3 light-colored sedans stood against the far wall. The first was empty. The second had a child seat. In the third... "Detective," the officer pointed to the navigator screen. "The route laid out 2 days ago, the road along the locks. The destination point was the same turn where the Maybach had gone underwater. The interrogation room smelled of coffee and fear. Martinez held on for 2 hours, then broke down. She only asked me to scare him." He stared at the floor. "Said, husband's cheating. Need to teach him a lesson. Drive out to meet him. Scare him a little. I didn't know anything about the hose, I swear." "Mrs. Caldwell is just a client?" "We dated. For a couple months. She's so... special. When she asks, you can't say no. She came here a lot. Stayed late. Talked about her husband, his mistress, the baby." Ramirez stared at the sedan frozen in the parking lot, silent proof of another link in the chain of crimes. The story was beginning to come together, a story of jealousy, hatred, and carefully planned retribution. The morning at the police department began as usual with coffee and reports. Ramirez was going over the mechanic's statement when the phone rang. "Detective, it's Dr. Chen from the clinic. We have a situation." 20 minutes later, Ramirez was standing in Dakota's office. The cleaning lady, an elderly Mexican woman, was nervously rubbing her apron. "I water the flowers every 3 days," her voice trembled. "And today I see red from under the pot. I thought it might be some kind of fertilizer. I picked it up and there it was." In the tray of a large ficus tree lay a knife. Elegant ebony handle, thin blade, the kind you'd find in any artist's store, used to cut canvases and stretchers. "We checked the blood traces," the CSI held out the folder. "Matches Dr. Everett's samples." Ramirez examined the knife. The killer had chosen the perfect spot. Who would lift a heavy ficus pot? Who would notice the dark stains on the black earth? "Check the art supply stores." He carefully packed the knife into an evidence bag, especially the ones where Mrs. Caldwell's gallery shops. Another detail in the big picture. Another step towards solving what she thought was a perfect crime. Ramirez picked up Grayson at 8 in the morning. "We have all the evidence." The detective held out a folder. "Knife at the clinic, mechanic's statement, camera footage. Let's go?" Grayson nodded silently and got into the car. On the way, he looked through the documents. Each page made the picture more and more monstrous. "Let's reconstruct the picture." Ramirez turned onto Michigan Avenue. She makes an appointment with Dr. Chen, creating an alibi for herself. Comes to the clinic early in the morning, waits for Dakota. After the murder, she hides the knife in a flower pot and goes to the appointment. While everyone's looking for the killer, she has an ironclad alibi. She was at the doctor's office. And Flint? Grayson's voice trembled. He realized something that night, something in the safe. She couldn't risk it. Convinced her mechanic lover to pony up on the road and cut the brakes herself. The plan was to kill us both. Grayson looked out the window. She thought Flint would drive me home on his own. But we got drunk, and he called a driver. Exactly. That broke her calculations. The car stopped at the gallery. Outside the huge windows, a graceful figure in white could be seen. Merritt was hanging paintings for a new exhibit, as flawless as ever, as perfect as ever. "Ready?" Ramirez turned to Grayson. "Yes, time to end this nightmare." Merritt didn't even flinch when they walked in, only adjusted the snow-white collar of her immaculate silk blouse. "Honey, is something wrong?" "Have a seat, Mrs. Caldwell." Ramirez nodded to the designer sofa against the wall. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About the appointment with Dr. Chen, about the art knife, about your affair with the mechanic." She was silent, her perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. "You know what strikes me most?" Ramirez sat down across from her. "The cold-bloodedness. You've calculated everything. The doctor's appointment is the perfect alibi. The knife hidden in the flower pot. The brakes cut. Even the lover was used. 15 years," her voice was calm. 15 years of perfect marriage, and then along comes this one. With her smiles, with her pregnancy, and everything falls apart. You killed 2 people. I was defending my life." Merritt looked at her husband. "You traded me for a whore who spread her legs for 2 men at once. You were willing to raise her a bastard. And me? What was I? You planned to kill me too. Of course. You were both supposed to be in that car. But you got drunk. Flint gave you a driver. Always so thoughtful, isn't he? Too bad he didn't take care of himself." She took out a cigarette. Her hands didn't shake. "You know what the funny thing is? I really loved him. Loved him for 15 years. And he traded me for a baby fantasy." "You didn't just kill Dakota and Flint," Grayson said quietly. "You killed our unborn daughter." "Daughter?" Merritt laughed. "A whore can't have a daughter. Just another whore." Ramirez nodded to the officers at the door. The handcuffs clicked. "Merritt Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murders of Dakota Everett and Flint Everett." She walked toward the police car, head held high. Impeccable posture, perfectly styled. Only there was darkness in her eyes. Fathomless, terrifying darkness. "Grayson!" She turned around at the car. "Did you ever think I could have given you a baby? That all you had to do was ask?" He watched in silence as she got into the car, as the door slammed shut, as the last shard of his former life disappeared around the corner. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Merritt didn't admit her guilt until the last day. She sat up straight, draped in a strict suit, and looked only forward. When the judge read out the sentence, 2 life sentences without parole, her face did not waver. A year passed. Grayswood Cemetery was drowning in fall leaves. Grayson stood by 2 black granite slabs. On one was Dakota's name and the dates of her short life. On the other, Flint's name. Between them was a small white slab. "Emily" was the only word carved into the marble. The name Dakota chose for her daughter. The Emily Foundation for Infertile Couples opened in the old Everett mansion. Here provided legal and psychological support, helped with treatment, paid for expensive procedures. In the lobby hung a portrait of Dakota. She smiled, putting her hand on her stomach. "We help dreams come true," Grayson said at the foundation's opening, "because every child deserves to be born. Every family deserves to be happy." He came to the cemetery every Sunday, brought white roses, Dakota's favorite flowers, talked to them both, talked about the foundation's successes, the families they helped, the babies that were born because of their support. And every time he left, he stopped at the little white slab. "I'm sorry, Emily," he whispered. "I'm sorry we couldn't protect you." The wind played with the fallen leaves. The sun was slipping toward sunset. Somewhere in the distance, children's laughter echoed. A young couple with a stroller were walking in a nearby alley. Life went on, and in this life there was a memory of those who loved too much and of the one who never saw the light.